Hello, welcome to our third podcast exploring human rights in BC, presented by VIARC, the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition. VIARC is a community-based nonprofit agency located on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, now known as Victoria, BC. We help individuals and organizations uphold and promote human rights through advocacy, support, and human rights education. If you feel you may have been unfairly treated or discriminated against for whatever reason, or would like to contact one of our advocates, please send us an email at contactvihrc@gmail.com or call us at 250-382-3012. You can also find more information on our website, vihrc.com, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter. In our first episode, we introduced the broad topic of how the BC Human Rights Code protects against all kinds of discrimination. We discussed what kinds of discrimination the code protects against and explored what a human rights complaint looks like in a case before the BC Human Rights Tribunal. In our second episode, we discussed the more specific topic of discrimination based on race from the perspective of the BC Human Rights Code. In this third episode, we'll be exploring the ways in which discrimination based on race intersects with other protected traits under the BC Human Rights Code, and how these traits are protected. Our discussion in this episode will build on the issues we talked about in the first and second episodes, so we recommend listening to those episodes first if you haven't already. We use the term intersecting as a reference to the feminist theory of intersectionality. This term broadly describes the interconnected nature of race, class, gender, disability, or other protected grounds as they apply to a given individual or group. Intersectionality recognizes how our society creates overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. But before we get into this, a quick disclaimer. This podcast does not contain legal advice. It contains general discussion of certain legal and related issues only. If you require legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. The BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner describes intersectionality as a concept first developed by lawyer, activist, and scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in relation to Black women and the law in the United States. Crenshaw noted that the legal system failed Black women because it did not acknowledge or address systemic inequalities linked to the intersection of racism and sexism. Since that time, the concept has been more broadly adopted in healthcare, education, and other areas. The BC Human Rights Code and Tribunal protect against discrimination or disadvantage based on protected characteristics. And today we will take a closer look at how they recognize the intersection or interconnected nature of those various protected characteristics.
The BC Human Rights Tribunal and the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal share a similar approach to cases recognizing the intersection of related protected characteristics. So this first example comes from Ontario, but has been followed in BC. It is an example of race intersecting with sex. The Ontario Human Rights Tribunal adopted an intersectional approach in 2003 with the case of Ms. Baylis Flannery. The complainant was a Black woman who was discriminated against in the workplace in a way that was both racialized and sexualized. Her employer made various unwanted sexual advances toward her. He also made racist and sexist jokes, frequently asking her uncomfortable sexual questions, and made inappropriate and racially charged and fetishizing comments about his sexual preferences. While the discrimination she faced could have allowed Ms. Baylis Flannery to succeed on either enumerated ground of race or sex, the tribunal wanted the law to see that she was not just a woman who happened to be Black or a Black person who happened to be a woman, but a Black woman. The discrimination she suffered was distinct and unique to the experience of Black women and how they face compounded disadvantage based on harmful stereotypes about their identities. The tribunal assessed that the effect of the compounded discrimination was more hurtful to Ms. Baylis Flannery's human dignity because it occurred on the whole. Merely looking at the two protected grounds of race and sex separately would fail to recognize the extent of the harm suffered because the discrimination attacked foundational and intersecting aspects of Ms. Baylis Flannery's identity. Therefore, the tribunal found that the impact of intersectional discrimination in this instance fell in a separate category of emotional harm and injury to dignity, which was greater than it would have been if the matter were based on a single ground or the two grounds separated from each other. This next example involves the intersection of race and sex with disability as protected grounds under the code.
Judy Wu filed a complaint at the BC Human Rights Tribunal against a number of respondents, claiming that they discriminated against her with respect to her employment and membership in a union or association on the basis of race, color, ancestry, place of origin, sex, and mental and physical disability. Ms. Wu alleged that she was harassed, intimidated, bullied, ignored, and ostracized at her workplace. She stated that she took a medical leave of absence because of the ongoing bullying. All of the people she worked with were white, and while her coworkers were allowed to express ideas, provide input, and participate in the workplace in an inclusive manner, she was not. She continually experienced racism and racist harassment, including threats of physical violence. Ms. Wu suffered from ill health as a result of the continual stress, and her racialization had been used against her in constructing her as mentally unstable, as having a perceived mental disability. Ms. Wu had taken medical leave, and respondents continued to treat her poorly as a result, showing the interconnected cycle of discrimination based on race with other forms of discrimination. The tribunal also recognized the nature of the discrimination she faced, particularly as an Asian woman. When Ms. Wu voiced concerns to her employer about her poor treatment in the workplace, she was treated with hostility because of the perception that as a Chinese Canadian woman, she was expected to be submissive and grateful for the employment opportunity she had without complaining about inequity, harassment, or discrimination. In other words, she faced more discrimination because she did not fit the harmful stereotype of an Asian woman. Thus, the tribunal recognized that Ms. Wu was multiply disadvantaged based on a number of intersecting grounds, race, disability, and sex, and dismissed the respondent's application to dismiss her claim.
Our final example is one we have discussed before. In our previous episode, we discussed the case of Ms. Raddick to examine how the BC Human Rights Tribunal recognizes discrimination based on race. This case is also a good example of how protected characteristics can intersect to form complex identities which must be protected from discrimination. In Raddick, the complainant had a disability and walked with a limp. This intersected with her indigeneity, resulting in discrimination. The security guard deemed her suspicious based on her limp, assuming, based on harmful negative stereotypes, that she might have been drunk or otherwise intoxicated. This is an example of how other protected characteristics can intersect with race, color, ancestry, and place of origin, and how the tribunal tries to protect individuals from intersecting forms of discrimination. It is also an example of the unique forms of discrimination that Indigenous people suffer due to Canada's colonial history. Given the unique circumstances of Indigenous individuals in Canada, the BC Human Rights Commissioner has recommended adopting a new protected ground, that of race and indigeneity, specific to Indigenous people who may face intersectional discrimination based on their Indigenous heritage, race, and gender, geographic and socioeconomic status. While indigeneity can be treated along racial lines, some think that it should be a separate protected trait which takes into account the unique forms of discrimination that Indigenous people face. On January 15, 2020, the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal released a report addressing serious access to justice concerns for Indigenous people bringing human rights complaints to the tribunal. The report makes far-reaching recommendations that could transform human rights in BC. One of the authors of the report surveyed over 100 Indigenous people who reported pervasive levels of discrimination. Many Indigenous people had no idea that the Human Rights Tribunal existed or how to access it. Many said that their experiences of racism as Indigenous people were so widespread that they did not believe it would make any difference to file a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal. The report makes several recommendations to evolve human rights law in BC. Among them, the main recommendations broaden the scope of human rights, including adding Indigenous identity to the BC Human Rights Code as a ground of discrimination, and incorporating Indigenous legal traditions and international human rights principles. This aligns with BC's recent commitment to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Adding indigeneity as a protected trait would be a step forward to recognize the intersectional experiences of Indigenous peoples. The tribunal has also appointed 3 new members who are Indigenous to increase the representation of Indigenous voices and experiences. That is the end of our episode and of this podcast series. We hope we have been able to show you the complex work of understanding discrimination through an intersectional approach and how the tribunal's approach works to recognize the unique experiences of individuals whose identity is not captured by simple lists of enumerated traits. Ultimately, this work allows us to better protect and provide remedy for those individuals who suffer compounded forms of discrimination and to continue to evolve our understanding and approach into the future. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Lauren and Nico with the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition.